Welcome, intrepid historians, to a journey into the fluid, often volatile, and always fascinating world of ancient Borderlands. For too long, history has been told from the centers of empires, from the capitals, the palaces, the legions. But what about the people living on the edges, where cultures collided, where loyalties were constantly tested, and where daily life was a masterclass in adaptation? This series, Beyond the Wall, Daily Life in Ancient Borderlands, offers a captivating glimpse into the everyday struggles and triumphs of these resilient communities. We'll explore the unique cultures forged in these contested zones, the constant challenges they faced, and the profound ways their lives were shaped by living between worlds. Join us as we step beyond the walls of empire to hear the unheard stories of the Borderlands. If you love uncovering the hidden side of history, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you don't miss an episode. Today, we're starting our journey at the very edge of the Roman Empire, standing in the shadow of one of its most monumental achievements, Hadrian's Wall. For nearly 3 centuries, this massive stone barrier wasn't just a line on a map. It was a living, breathing frontier, a vibrant world unto itself. But have you ever wondered what life was actually like here for the people who called this wild northern landscape home? Forget the silent ruins you see today. Let's travel back in time, nearly 2,000 years, to a place teeming with life, noise, and incredible diversity. Imagine this. You're standing right here, but instead of quiet fields, you're surrounded by the sounds of a bustling fort. You hear the rhythmic stomp of hobnailed sandals on gravel, as a century of soldiers drills in the parade ground. The sharp commands of a centurion, spoken in crisp Latin, cut through the air. You can hear the clang of hammers on anvils from the blacksmith's forge, where swords are being sharpened and armor repaired. It's a constant hum of military precision and readiness. These weren't just a few isolated outposts. Along the 73-mile length of the wall, there were over a dozen major forts, like housesteads, Vindolanda, and Chesters, each housing hundreds of soldiers. And these soldiers weren't just one homogeneous group of Italians. Far from it. The Roman army was a true melting pot. In the garrisons here, you would find men from all corners of the empire. There were auxiliary units of Tungrians from modern-day Belgium, Batavians from the Netherlands, skilled archers from Syria, and fierce cavalrymen from Spain and North Africa. Picture these men, thousands of miles from their homelands, forming a unique brotherhood. They shared cramped barracks, ate simple rations of bread, cheese, and vegetable stew, and stood watch together on the cold, often rainy battlements, staring out into the misty hills of Caledonia. They would have shared stories of their distant homes, taught each other phrases in their native languages, and forged powerful bonds of camaraderie, essential for survival in such a remote and potentially hostile posting. Their letters, miraculously preserved on wooden tablets found at Vindolanda, give us a stunningly personal glimpse into their lives. They write home asking for warmer socks, complain about the terrible British weather, and invite friends to birthday parties. These weren't just faceless legionaries. They were real people with hopes, fears, and a longing for connection. But the story of Hadrian's Wall doesn't end at the fort gates. Step outside the military walls, and you enter another world entirely, the Vicus. These were the sprawling civilian settlements that sprang up like mushrooms around every major fort. The Wiki were the lifeblood of the frontier, a chaotic, energetic mix of commerce and community. Here, the air would be thick with the smells of wood smoke from cooking fires, roasting meat from a tavern, and maybe the less pleasant odors of a tannery. You'd see merchants from Gaul selling fine pottery and wine, local Britons trading grain and livestock, and artisans crafting everything from leather boots to intricate jewelry. The streets, likely muddy and crowded, would be filled with a babble of languages, the formal Latin of the officials, the Greek spoken by traders from the east, and the local Celtic dialects of the native population. These settlements were home to a fascinating cast of characters. There were the soldiers' unofficial families, their wives and children who, while not officially permitted within the fort itself, created a home just outside its walls. There were retired veterans who chose to stay in the area they had defended for decades, opening a tavern or a small farm. There were shopkeepers, innkeepers, bathhouse attendants, brewers, and entertainers, all drawn to the frontier by the promise of the soldiers' wages. The Vicus was a place where cultures collided and mingled, creating a unique Romano-British society. It was a place you could grab a hot meal, have a drink with a soldier just off duty, visit a temple dedicated to a god from a distant land, or simply watch the endless flow of people that made this frontier so dynamic. These towns weren't just temporary camps. They became permanent homes. Archaeologists have unearthed the foundations of shops, houses, and temples. They found personal items like hairpins, gaming pieces, and children's toys, painting a rich picture of family life. These communities, nestled against the stone ramparts of the forts, demonstrate that Hadrian's Wall was more than a military barrier. It was a zone of interaction, a place of opportunity, and a crucible where different cultures met, clashed, and ultimately created something new. So, when we look at the remnants of Hadrian's Wall, we're not just looking at a defensive structure. We're seeing the ghost of a vibrant, multicultural society that thrived on the very edge of the known world for hundreds of years. The soldiers in their forts and the civilians in their wiki together formed the beating heart of Roman Britain as northern frontier. Their stories, etched into the landscape and buried beneath our feet, are a powerful testament to the resilience and adaptability of people in even the most challenging of environments. Step beyond the orderly world of Roman Britain, and let's venture into the wild, untamed lands to the north. Across the wall, a different story unfolds, one that Roman propaganda often painted with a single, broad brushstroke. Barbarian. But who were these people? Welcome to Caledonia, the land the Romans could never truly conquer. Forget the neat grid lines of Roman towns. Here, life was etched into the very hills and valleys. Imagine communities clustered in formidable hill forts, their ramparts of earth and stone rising from the landscape, or scattered in smaller settlements nestled in protective glens. These weren't chaotic savages. They were societies with deep roots, their daily rhythm dictated by the seasons, the movement of livestock, and the ancient ties of clan and kin. Their world was one of pastoral farming, raising cattle and sheep, supplemented by the thrill of the hunt for deer and wild boar in the dense forests. Their homes, often roundhouses built of timber and wattle and daub, would have been filled with the warmth of a central hearth, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and cooking stews. Picture families gathered, sharing stories passed down through generations, not in Latin, but in their own vibrant Brythonic languages, the ancestors of modern Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. Listen closely, and you can almost hear the echoes of their daily rituals, the chants of their druids, and the powerful guttural war cries that would send shivers down a legionary's spine. These were the people the Romans called the Caledonii, a confederation of tribes united by a common culture and a fierce love for their freedom. Names like the Maetai and the Damnoni might be footnotes in Roman texts, but here they were powerful forces. Their warriors, often painted with woad to intimidate their enemies, were masters of their environment. They knew every secret path, every treacherous bog, every hidden valley in this challenging terrain. This knowledge was their greatest weapon. Roman legions, accustomed to open-field battles on the plains of Europe, found themselves at a profound disadvantage. The Caledonians wouldn't meet them head-on in a pitched battle unless the odds were overwhelmingly in their favor. Instead, they perfected the art of guerrilla warfare. They would melt into the forests and hills, launching sudden, brutal raids on Roman patrols, supply lines, and the small forts or mile castles that dotted the wall. They'd strike like lightning and vanish just as quickly, leaving chaos and confusion in their wake. For the Roman soldiers garrisoned on the frontier, life was a state of constant, gnawing tension. Every shadow in the woods, every strange sound on the wind could signal an impending attack. The wall wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a psychological one, separating the known world of Roman order from a land that stubbornly refused to be tamed. The Caledonians weren't just raiding for plunder. They were fighting for their very identity, their ancestral lands, and their right to live unburdened by the eagle standards of a foreign empire. This relentless resistance is what makes the story of Hadrian's Wall so compelling. It wasn't a peaceful border. It was a live, active, and often bloody frontier. The Caledonians' determination ensured that for centuries, the northern edge of the Roman Empire was not a line on a map, but a dynamic zone of conflict, negotiation, and cultural collision. Their struggle is a powerful reminder that history is not just written by the conquerors, but also by the unyielding spirit of those who resist. They were the people beyond the wall, the guardians of a free Caledonia, and their legacy is carved into the very landscape of northern Britain. Despite the towering walls and legions of soldiers, the border between Roman Britain and Caledonia wasn't just a line of conflict. It was a place of connection, a cultural crossroads where two vastly different worlds met, mingled, and created something entirely new. For every clash of swords, there were countless unseen, unrecorded moments of human interaction that tell a much more complex story. Let's peel back the layers of history and discover this fascinating hybrid culture. Imagine a Roman soldier posted thousands of miles from his home in Italy or Spain, standing guard on a windswept wall. Day after day, he sees the same local people passing by. Curiosity turns into conversation, perhaps a shared joke or the trade of a small trinket. This is where the story begins, not in the grand strategies of emperors, but in the simple, everyday interactions between people. Trade was the lifeblood of this exchange. While official policy might have been to keep the barbarians out, the reality on the ground was far different. Clandestine markets likely sprung up in the shadow of the forts. Picture a Caledonian hunter, bartering a prime deer pelt for a finely crafted Roman pot or a flask of wine from Gaul. These weren't just economic transactions. They were cultural handshakes. Archaeologists have unearthed a treasure trove of evidence that backs this up. Roman coins, pottery, glassware, and jewelry have been discovered far beyond the frontier, deep within what was considered hostile Caledonian territory. How did they get there? Some were undoubtedly spoils of war, but many more were clearly the result of peaceful trade. These items weren't just curiosities. They became status symbols for Caledonian chieftains, integrating Roman material culture into their own society. A chief might drink from a Roman glass or wear a Roman brooch, not as a sign of submission, but as a display of his influence and his ability to acquire exotic goods. But the flow of culture wasn't just a one-way street. The Romans, especially the civilians and auxiliary troops who lived in the *wiki*, the towns that grew up around the forts, were also changed by their new environment. They adopted local building techniques, using native stone and timber. Their diets likely incorporated local foods and game. They learned the names of the local gods and spirits, sometimes even merging them with their own Roman deities in a process called syncretism. Temples have been found dedicated to hybrid gods, part Roman, part Celtic, a testament to a shared spiritual landscape. Perhaps the most profound form of exchange was the most personal: love and family. While Roman soldiers were officially forbidden to marry during their 25 years of service, this was a rule that was widely ignored. In the settlements around the forts, soldiers formed relationships with local Caledonian women. These unions were more than just temporary arrangements. They were the foundation of new families and new communities. Imagine the children born from these relationships. They would have grown up in a world that was neither fully Roman nor fully Caledonian. They might have spoken Latin with their father and a Celtic dialect with their mother. They would have celebrated Roman festivals and also understood the ancient traditions of their mother's people. They were the living embodiment of this frontier culture, a walking, talking fusion of two worlds. When a soldier finally retired, he would gain citizenship for himself and his family. His children, once considered illegitimate, were now Roman citizens, entitled to all its rights and privileges. This was a powerful tool of Romanization, but it was a two-way street. These new citizens brought their Celtic heritage with them, weaving it into the fabric of Roman Britain. The border, therefore, wasn't a static barrier. It was a permeable membrane, constantly pulsing with the flow of goods, ideas, and people. This challenges our typical view of empires as monolithic forces that simply crush and replace local cultures. On the Caledonian frontier, what we see is something more nuanced, a process of negotiation, adaptation, and fusion. The Romans brought their legions and their laws, but the Caledonians had their resilience, their deep knowledge of the land, and their own vibrant culture. Neither side could completely dominate the other. Instead, over generations, a unique border identity was forged. People living here might have identified as Romang, but their daily lives, their beliefs, and even their bloodlines told a more complicated story. They were a people of the frontier, shaped by the constant presence of the other. They were a testament to the idea that even in the face of walls and weapons, human connection finds a way. The line on the map was clear, but the lines between people were beautifully, fascinatingly blurred. This hybrid culture is the forgotten legacy of Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall. It's a reminder that history is rarely a simple story of black and white, of us versus them. It's most often found in the shades of gray, in the spaces in between, where different worlds collide and create something new and unexpected. The real story of the Roman Caledonian border isn't just about war. It's about the enduring human capacity to connect, to trade, to love, and to build a shared world, even on the very edge of an empire. Imagine this. You're a Roman legionary, thousands of miles from the sun-drenched shores of Italy, stationed at the very edge of the known world. Before you, the wild, untamed lands of Caledonia. Behind you, the sprawling Roman Empire. And separating the two, a colossal stone barrier stretching 73 miles from coast to coast, Hadrian's Wall. This wasn't just a wall. It was your life, your home, and your constant, unblinking duty. For those who lived and served here, the threat of raids from the northern tribes wasn't a distant possibility, it was a daily reality. This constant state of alert shaped every aspect of life, turning Hadrian's Wall into a living, breathing frontier, a place of perpetual readiness. The sun has barely begun to climb over the misty Northumbrian hills, but the wall is already awake. The first shift is ending, the second beginning. The air is cold, sharp, and it bites at any exposed skin. You pull your woolen cloak tighter as you take your position on the rampart walk. Down below, the rhythmic tramp of hobnailed sandals echoes as a patrol sets out from the Mile Castle Gate. These patrols were the lifeblood of the wall's defense. Small groups of soldiers, usually around 8 men led by a centurion, would march along the military way that ran parallel to the wall or along the top of the wall itself. Their mission? To see and be seen, to project Roman power, and to spot any signs of trouble before it could escalate. They'd check the turrets, exchange passwords with the sentries, and scan the horizon for the faintest plume of smoke or glint of metal that might betray an approaching warband. Life was a cycle of watches, patrols, and drills. A soldier's day was meticulously structured. You might spend a 4-hour watch in a turret, your eyes straining to pierce the frequent fog and rain. Your world would shrink to that small stone room and the stretch of barren landscape in front of you. You'd be listening for the snap of a twig, the cry of a bird that sounds just a little too human. Every sense was on high alert. The silence of the night watch was the most unnerving. The darkness out there wasn't empty. It was filled with unseen dangers. The flickering torchlight cast long, dancing shadows, playing tricks on the mind. Was that the wind whistling through the crags? Or was it the low, guttural call of a Pictish scout? This constant vigilance took a psychological toll. It fostered a unique bond between the soldiers, a brotherhood forged in shared hardship and mutual reliance. You trusted the man next to you with your life, because you had to. The wall wasn't just a single line of stone. It was a complex, integrated defensive system. Every mile, there was a mile castle, a small fortlet that housed a garrison of perhaps 30 to 60 men. Between each mile castle stood 2 evenly spaced turrets, serving as observation posts and signal stations. An alarm could be raised in moments. A horn blast from a turret would be picked up by the next, and the next, a ripple of sound carrying the warning down the line. At the mile castle, the call to arms would ring out, "Ad arma." Men would scramble from their bunks, grabbing helmets, shields, and pila. The gates would be secured, and reinforcements would rush to the threatened section of the wall. Larger forts, like Housesteads or Vindolanda, were positioned just behind the wall, ready to dispatch larger cavalry and infantry units to intercept any significant incursions. It was a well-oiled machine, designed for rapid response. The effectiveness of this system relied heavily on communication. A sophisticated network of signal towers allowed for messages to be transmitted rapidly across long distances using torches, smoke signals, or even polished bronze mirrors to flash signals on sunny days. This meant that a commander at a major fort could be aware of a raid happening miles away within minutes and could coordinate a response. The Romans were masters of logistics and engineering, and this was on full display along the frontier. They built military roads to move troops and supplies quickly. They managed supply chains that brought grain from the south, pottery from Gaul, and wine from Spain to these remote outposts. Maintaining this massive defensive structure was a monumental undertaking, requiring thousands of soldiers not just for fighting, but for quarrying stone, repairing sections of the wall, and keeping the entire system operational. But what were they defending against? The threat wasn't typically a massive, organized army seeking to conquer Roman Britain. It was more often a war of attrition, a campaign of hit-and-run raids. Small, fast-moving war bands from tribes like the Picts would cross the frontier, looking to steal cattle, capture slaves, or simply prove their martial prowess. They knew the terrain intimately, the bogs, the forests, the hidden valleys. They would strike quickly, targeting isolated farmsteads or supply convoys, and then melt back into the wilderness before a Roman legion could respond in force. For the soldiers on the wall, this meant the enemy could be anywhere at any time. The tension was constant. Every patrol was a potential ambush. Every night watch could be the one where the silence was broken by the terrifying war cries of a raiding party. This state of perpetual readiness didn't just affect the soldiers. Along the wall, vibrant civilian settlements, known as wiki, grew up around the forts. These were bustling communities of merchants, artisans, innkeepers, and the families of the soldiers themselves. While they brought a semblance of normal life to the frontier, with taverns, bathhouses, and markets, their inhabitants also lived under the shadow of the wall. A raid could just as easily target their homes and businesses. For them, the sight of legionaries on the ramparts and the sound of patrols marching past was a constant reminder of both their protection and their peril. Their prosperity was directly linked to the security the wall provided. A breach in the wall wasn't just a military problem. It was an existential threat to their entire community. Everyone, from the highest-ranking commander to the lowest tavern keeper, understood that their survival depended on the strength and vigilance of the men standing guard. Life here was a paradox. It was a place of extreme discipline and order set against a backdrop of chaos and savagery. Soldiers would spend their off-duty hours gambling with dice, writing letters home on thin wooden tablets, or visiting the local bathhouse. These moments of normalcy were precious, a brief respite from the ever-present tension. But the call to duty was never far away. The discovery of the Vindolanda tablets gives us an incredible personal insight into this life. We read a soldier complaining about the terrible British weather, another inviting a friend to a birthday party, and an officer's wife receiving a social invitation. These documents reveal the human side of the frontier, the ordinary lives lived in extraordinary circumstances. They show us that these weren't just anonymous cogs in the Roman war machine. They were people with hopes, fears, and frustrations, all trying to carve out an existence on the windswept edge of the empire. As the years and decades turned into centuries, generations of soldiers served and died on this frontier. The nature of the threat evolved, but the fundamental duty of the patrolman remained the same. Watch, wait, and be ready. This constant state of vigilance forged a unique culture, a frontier mentality that was a blend of Roman discipline and rugged self-reliance. It shaped the very landscape, leaving behind not just a wall of stone, but a legacy etched into the memory of the land itself. The daily patrols, the tense night watches, the sudden calls to arms, this was the rhythm of life on Hadrian's wall. It was a relentless, demanding existence, but it was what kept the peace and secured the northern border of the Roman Empire for nearly 300 years. Life on the northern frontier of the Roman Empire wasn't just about soldiers marching and trumpets sounding. For every legionary standing guard on Hadrian's wall, there were dozens, even hundreds, of ordinary people just trying to make a life for themselves in a tough, unforgiving landscape. We're stepping away from the forts and battlefields to explore the untold story of these forgotten communities. The farmers, the herders, the families who called the Borderlands home. This is the story of survival, resilience, and daily life on the edge of the world. Imagine waking up not to the sound of a bugle call, but to the crisp, damp air of the northern British moors. Your world isn't defined by military strategy, but by the turning of the seasons. This was the reality for the vast majority of people living near the frontier. They were a mix of indigenous Britons, whose families had lived here for generations, and Romanized settlers drawn to the fringes of the empire. Whether they lived in traditional roundhouses or the more rectangular Roman-style farmsteads, their fundamental concerns were the same: food, shelter, and family. Archaeological evidence paints a fascinating picture of their agricultural lives. Instead of vast, sprawling estates, we find small, enclosed fields, often called cord-rig cultivation. These are narrow, parallel ridges, painstakingly dug by hand, probably with an ard, a simple scratch plow. This method was incredibly labor-intensive, but effective for aerating the heavy, damp soil and improving drainage, which was crucial in this wet climate. These weren't cash crops for export. These were subsistence plots. The farmers would have been growing hardy cereals, like spelt wheat and six-row barley. These grains were tough, resilient, and could withstand the shorter growing seasons and less than ideal conditions of the north. Every single grain harvested was precious, representing another day's worth of bread or porridge, another day of security for their family. But life here was never just about planting crops. The rugged landscape, with its vast moorlands and hilly terrain, was far better suited to pastoral farming. Herds of cattle and immense flocks of sheep were a common sight, grazing on the open uplands. These animals were a walking larder and a complete survival kit. Cattle provided not just meat, but also milk for cheese and yogurt, leather for shoes and clothing, and bone for tools. Their manure was an essential fertilizer for those precious crop fields, completing a vital agricultural cycle. Sheep were perhaps even more important. They offered meat and milk, but their true value was in their wool. Wool was the primary textile of the Roman world, and the north became a major center for its production. The entire family, from children to the elderly, would have been involved in the process, shearing the sheep, washing and carding the wool, spinning it into thread and weaving it into cloth for cloaks, tunics, and blankets. This wasn't a hobby. It was a fundamental activity for staying warm and alive through the long, harsh winters. The relationship between these farming communities and the Roman military was complex and symbiotic. The army was a huge, hungry machine that needed to be fed. The forts along the wall represented a massive, stable market right on the farmer's doorstep. Local communities would have supplied the garrisons with grain, meat, leather, and textiles, often as part of their tax obligations, known as the annona. This wasn't always a willing exchange. The army's demands could be a heavy burden, but it also provided a degree of economic stability and an injection of Roman currency into the local economy. Coins found at small farmstead sites show that these seemingly isolated communities were very much part of the wider Roman economic system. They weren't just subjects of the empire. They were active participants, trading their surplus for Roman pottery, glassware, or other goods that made their way up the supply lines from the heart of the empire. Life was a constant negotiation with the environment. Shelter was a primary concern. Homes had to be built to withstand lashing rain and biting winds. Stone and turf were the most common building materials. Thick walls, often several feet deep, provided excellent insulation. Roofs would have been thatched with reeds or heather, materials gathered from the local landscape. Inside, a central hearth would have been the heart of the home, providing not just warmth, but also light and a place to cook. The smoke, filtering up through the thatch, would have helped to cure meats hung from the rafters and keep insects at bay. Every aspect of the home was designed for maximum efficiency and survival. Managing resources was a skill honed over generations. Foraging was essential. The woods and moors provided nuts, berries, and mushrooms to supplement the diet. Hunting, while perhaps restricted in some areas, would have provided a welcome source of protein, with deer, boar, and wild birds on the menu. Beyond the physical challenges, there was the psychological reality of living on a frontier. This was the edge, the line between the civilized Roman world and the barbarian lands beyond. While the wall offered a sense of security, the threat of raids was ever present. A bad harvest could mean starvation. A sick animal could cripple a family's economic standing. This constant uncertainty bred a powerful sense of community and resilience. Neighbors would have relied on each other for help during planting and harvesting, for support during illness, and for collective defense. Family and kinship ties were the strongest social safety net they had. The people here were resourceful, adaptable, and incredibly tough. They had to be. Their daily lives were a testament to the human ability to create a home and a community in even the most challenging of circumstances. They were the silent, unsung foundation upon which the Roman frontier was built, their legacy etched not in grand inscriptions, but in the faint outlines of their fields and the quiet resilience of their spirit. So the next time you picture the Roman frontier, don't just see the soldiers in their gleaming armor. Picture the farmer, hands in the soil, praying for a good harvest. Picture the shepherdess guiding her flock across a misty moor, her cloak pulled tight against the wind. And picture the family, huddled around the hearth fire, sharing stories and finding warmth in a cold, wild land. It is in their story that we find the true, enduring strength of the Roman world. Now, let's travel east to the shadow of one of the most incredible structures ever built by human hands, the Great Wall of China. For thousands of miles, this colossal serpent of stone and earth snakes across mountains and deserts. But it wasn't just a wall. It was a living, breathing border, populated by hundreds of thousands of souls. Our focus now is on them, the soldiers, the sentinels, the families who called this monumental frontier their home. Imagine waking up before dawn. The air is bitingly cold, a relentless wind howling through the crenellations of your watchtower. This small stone box, one of tens of thousands, is your world. Your view is a vast, often desolate landscape. To one side, the sprawling empire you've sworn to protect. To the other, the expansive, unknown territories of the steppe nomads. The solitude here is a character in itself, a constant companion. Days are defined by a strict, monotonous routine. Patrols along your designated section of the wall, your footsteps echoing those of countless soldiers before you. You're constantly checking for signs of movement, for the glint of steel or the dust cloud of approaching riders on the horizon. Life wasn't just about watching and waiting. The wall was a constant work in progress, always demanding maintenance. You'd hear the clang of hammers on stone, the scrape of shovels, the shouts of commands as teams worked to repair sections damaged by the harsh weather or the passage of time. This wasn't a glorious battle. It was grueling, back-breaking labor under a searing sun or in freezing winds. The soldiers here weren't just warriors. They were masons, laborers, and engineers, all rolled into one. Their primary enemy wasn't always an invading army, but often the relentless forces of nature itself. Conscripts, convicts, or disgraced officials were often sent to the frontier. Service was harsh. The supplies could be inconsistent, the pay meager, and the isolation could weigh heavily on the mind. You'd spend your days training, drilling with your spear or bow, practicing formations. The discipline was ironclad, because a single moment of laxity could mean disaster for the garrison and the lands beyond. In the quiet moments, you'd stare out at the endless expanse and dream. You'd dream of home, of the family you left behind, of the warmth of a familiar meal. Letters were rare and took months, if they arrived at all. The longing for home was a palpable ache, a constant undercurrent to the daily grind. Yet, it wasn't all despair. There was a unique camaraderie forged in these remote outposts. You relied on your fellow soldiers for everything, for your safety during a patrol, for a shared story around a small fire, for a moment of laughter to break the monotony. These were the men you faced the unknown with, day in and day out. Promotions were a beacon of hope, a chance to improve your station, earn more pay, or perhaps even earn a transfer back to the heart of the empire. A soldier who showed bravery, diligence, or skill could rise through the ranks, from a simple foot soldier to a commander of a garrison. This hope was a powerful motivator, pushing men to endure the incredible hardships. And we can't forget the families. In many of the larger garrisons and frontier towns that grew up along the wall, soldiers' families were present. Wives and children brought a semblance of normalcy to this military world. They ran households, tended to small vegetable plots, and turned these stark fortresses into communities. The sounds of children playing might drift up to the sentries on the ramparts, a poignant reminder of what they were there to protect. These families faced the same dangers and isolation as the soldiers, their lives intrinsically tied to the fate of the wall. They were the unsung guardians of the empire, providing the emotional anchor that helped soldiers endure their lonely vigil. The watchtowers themselves were marvels of communication. A complex system of smoke signals by day and fire signals by night allowed messages to travel hundreds of miles in just a few hours. A puff of smoke, a blazing beacon, this was the ancient internet of its time. A sentry spotting an approaching threat would light a signal fire, which would then be spotted by the next tower, and the next, and the next, creating a chain reaction that alerted the entire defensive line and sent word to the capital. Imagine the tension of seeing that first plume of smoke on the horizon, knowing that it could be the prelude to a full-scale invasion. The fate of the empire could rest on your ability to quickly and accurately relay that signal. So, when we look at the Great Wall today, let's see more than just an architectural wonder. Let's see the watchtowers not as empty stone husks, but as lonely homes. Let's hear the echoes of marching feet on the ramparts, the shouts of commands, the distant calls of sentries, and the quiet whispers of soldiers longing for home. This wasn't just a wall of stone. It was a wall of people, a testament to their resilience, their sacrifice, and their enduring hope in the face of a vast and unforgiving frontier. Their stories are baked into the very mortar that holds these ancient stones together. Beyond the shadow of the Great Wall, where the earth stretches out to meet an endless sky, lies the vast, untamed steppe. This wasn't an empty wilderness. It was the heartland of some of history's most formidable peoples. For centuries, this was the domain of the horse lords, nomadic empires that rose and fell with the seasons, shaping the destiny of nations. We ride north to uncover the world of these legendary horsemen, from the Xiongnu, who challenged the mighty Han dynasty, to the Mongols, who would later build the largest contiguous empire the world has ever known. This is the story of the thunder of hooves, of life lived on the move, and of the dynamic relationship between the settled and the nomadic, the farmer and the herdsman. Forget the stereotypes of simple barbarians. The reality is far more complex, fascinating, and powerful. Life on the steppe was a life in motion, dictated by the needs of the herds. The very rhythm of existence was tied to the grazing patterns of sheep, goats, cattle, and most importantly, horses. Imagine waking not to the sight of a permanent home, but to the soft morning light filtering through the felt walls of a ger or yurt. The air would be crisp, filled with the sounds of the herd and the scent of burning dung, the primary fuel source on the treeless plains. This constant movement wasn't aimless wandering. It was a calculated seasonal migration known as the odor, a sophisticated system of pasture rotation that ensured the long-term health of both their animals and the grasslands. A family's wealth wasn't measured in land or gold, but in the number and quality of their livestock. These animals were their walking pantry, their clothing store, and their bank account, all rolled into one. From their milk, they made cheese, yogurt, and the famous fermented Mares milk, arag. Their meat provided sustenance. Their wool and hides provided clothing and shelter, and their bones were even used for tools and games. This deep, symbiotic relationship with their animals was the absolute bedrock of their society. The heart of this nomadic world, its engine and its soul, was the horse. A steppe nomad without a horse was not just an inconvenience, it was a crisis. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk, becoming one with their mounts. These weren't just any horses. They were a unique breed, smaller and stockier than their counterparts in the sedentary world, but possessing incredible endurance and resilience. They could survive harsh winters, find forage under snow, and carry their riders for days on end. Horsemanship was an art form. Riders could twist in their saddles, firing arrows with deadly accuracy in any direction. The legendary Parthian shot was a tactic perfected by numerous steppe peoples. They could hang off the side of their horse to use it as a shield, or guide it with just their knees, leaving their hands free for the bow. This mastery gave them unparalleled mobility. An army of horsemen could cover vast distances at a speed that was simply unimaginable to the infantry-based armies of settled civilizations. This speed was their greatest strategic asset, allowing them to appear as if from nowhere, strike with devastating force, and vanish back into the vastness of the steppe before a response could be mounted. The primary weapon that complemented their horsemanship was the composite bow. This was a technological marvel, far superior to the simple wooden bows used by many of their contemporaries. It was constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, laminated together with animal-based glue. This complex construction gave it immense power and a compact size, making it perfect for use on horseback. An experienced archer could unleash a hail of arrows, capable of piercing armor at a considerable distance. Their military tactics were a direct reflection of their lifestyle, fluid, opportunistic, and relentless. They rarely engaged in the kind of set-piece battles favored by agricultural empires. Instead, they relied on feigned retreats, drawing their enemies into a disorganized pursuit before turning to shower them with arrows. They would encircle their foes, skirmishing from a distance, wearing them down physically and psychologically. This swarm tactic, combined with their unmatched mobility, made them one of the most effective fighting forces in the pre-modern world. The thunder of thousands of hooves and the whistle of a sky full of arrows was a terrifying, awe-inspiring sight that broke the will of many a disciplined army. But life wasn't just about herding and warfare. Steppe society was organized around clans and tribes, complex webs of kinship that formed the basis of political and social life. Loyalty was paramount, first to the family, then to the clan, and finally to the tribe. At the center of the community was the campfire, a place for sharing stories, singing epic poems accompanied by the Morin Kur, the horsehead fiddle, and making important decisions. It was here that traditions were passed down, alliances were forged, and disputes were settled. Their social structure could be surprisingly fluid. While it was a patriarchal society, women held significant authority. They were responsible for managing the camp, packing and unpacking the gears, controlling the family's resources, and raising the children. In the absence of the men, who could be away for long periods on hunts or raids, women effectively ran the entire domestic economy. In some cases, high-status women could even wield considerable political influence, acting as regents or advisors. This practical division of labor was essential for survival in a world where everyone had to contribute. The relationship between the nomadic empires and the settled Chinese civilization to the south was a constant push and pull, a complex dance of conflict and codependence. To the Chinese court, the people of the steppe were often viewed as uncivilized barbarians, a constant threat on their northern frontier. This fear and disdain led to the construction of one of the world's greatest engineering marvels, the Great Wall. The wall wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a psychological and cultural dividing line, meant to separate the world of the farmer from the world of the nomad. However, it was never a perfect seal. For the nomads, the settled lands of China were a tempting source of goods they couldn't produce themselves: grain, silk, tea, and metalwork. This created a dynamic where raiding and trading were two sides of the same coin. When the nomads were strong and unified under a powerful leader, or khan, they could demand tribute and favorable trade terms through military pressure. A raid wasn't just mindless destruction. It was often a calculated political and economic strategy. "Give us the silk and grain we need," the raid implied, "or we will simply come and take it." When diplomacy prevailed, or when the nomadic confederations were less unified, trade flourished. The so-called Silk Road was not just one road, but a network of routes, and the nomads were the masters of the northern corridors. They were the middlemen, the guides, and the protectors of the caravans that traversed the vast distances of Central Asia. They traded their own products, horses, furs, and salt, for the agricultural and luxury goods of the south. This interaction was transformative for both sides. The nomads adopted technologies and luxury goods, and their elites often developed a taste for the finer things in life. The Chinese, in turn, were deeply influenced by their nomadic neighbors, especially in military matters. They adopted cavalry tactics, superior breeds of horses, and even elements of clothing, like trousers, which were far more practical for riding than traditional robes. This centuries-long interaction demonstrates that the Great Wall was less of a firm border and more of a semi-permeable membrane through which goods, ideas, and people constantly flowed, creating a rich and often turbulent shared history. The legacy of the steppe horsemen is etched into the DNA of world history. They were not just raiders. They were empire builders, cultural brokers, and the architects of a unique and resilient way of life. The Xiongnu, the Turks, and most famously, the Mongols under Chinggis Khan, didn't just challenge the established world order, they remade it. They connected east and west like never before, creating a vast zone of trade and communication that stretched across Eurasia. They demonstrated that a society built on mobility and pastoralism could project power on a global scale. Their story is a powerful reminder that civilization takes many forms and that the vast, open spaces of the world have produced cultures just as complex and influential as those that grew from settled soil. They were the masters of the grasslands, the riders of the wind, and their thundering hooves echo through the corridors of history. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey across the steppes. It's a vast and incredible history, and we've only just scratched the surface. If you found this fascinating, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the past. Hey everyone, and welcome back. Last time, we talked about the Great Wall and the epic clashes between Imperial China and the nomadic peoples of the north. But history is never just about war, is it? It's also about people. And what happens when those people, even on opposite sides of a conflict, start to meet, trade, and talk? We're diving into one of the most fascinating aspects of this relationship, the bustling, vibrant world of cross-cultural encounters along the frontier. So let's set the scene. Forget the image of a silent, desolate wall for a moment. Instead, picture a noisy, colorful marketplace right on the edge of the empire. This is a frontier town, a place where two worlds collide in the most productive way possible. On one side, you have Chinese merchants, their stalls overflowing with shimmering silks, finely crafted pottery, fragrant tea, and life-sustaining grain. On the other side, nomadic traders arrive with the treasures of the steppe, powerful, sturdy horses, the most prized commodity of all, along with luxurious furs, durable leather goods, and high-quality livestock. This wasn't just casual shopping. This was a deep economic interdependence. The Chinese dynasties needed horses desperately. A strong cavalry was the only effective military response to the swift, mobile nomadic warriors. Without a steady supply of horses from the steppe, their armies would be at a massive disadvantage. For the nomads, Chinese goods weren't just luxuries. They were essentials. Grain supplemented their pastoral diet, especially during harsh winters, and items like silk and metalwork became important status symbols within their own societies. This mutual need created a powerful incentive for peace, often more effective than any wall. These markets became melting pots, places where different languages mingled, bargains were struck, and ordinary people formed relationships that defied the political tensions swirling around them. But it wasn't just merchants meeting at the border. There was also high-stakes diplomacy happening at the highest levels. Imagine a nomadic envoy, a powerful chieftain, or his representative, leading a delegation deep into the heart of China, all the way to the emperor's court in Chang'an or Beijing. These weren't simple visits. They were carefully choreographed political theater. The nomads would present tribute, often those valuable horses and furs we mentioned, as a sign of respect. In return, the Chinese emperor would bestow lavish gifts, bolts of silk, gold, and official titles. Now, you might think this sounds like the nomads were submitting to Chinese authority, but it's much more complex. From the Chinese perspective, this tributary system reinforced their view of the world, with the emperor at the center, graciously receiving homage from all surrounding peoples. It was a powerful ideological statement. But from the nomadic perspective, they often saw it as a very clever form of trade. They'd give some horses, and in return, get a massive amount of valuable goods, often worth far more than the tribute they offered. It was a win-win. They got the supplies they needed, and the Chinese court got the political legitimacy and security it craved. It was a brilliant, if sometimes fragile, system for managing relations without constant warfare. Of course, this balance was incredibly delicate. The line between trade and tribute, between a gift and a demand, was often blurry. Sometimes, these diplomatic missions were incredibly tense. A perceived insult, a disagreement over the value of goods, or a shift in political power on either side could cause the entire system to break down, plunging the border back into conflict. There were periods when a Chinese dynasty was weak, and they would be the ones paying tribute, often disguised as gifts or subsidies, to powerful nomadic confederations like the Xiongnu or the Mongols, just to keep them from raiding. This shows that power dynamics were constantly shifting. The frontier was never static. It was a fluctuating zone of peace and tension, trade and tribute, coexistence and conflict. One of the most interesting forms of this diplomacy was the policy of asterisk neck and asterisk, or peace through kinship. This involved the strategic marriage of Chinese princesses to powerful nomadic rulers. On the surface, the idea was to create a familial bond, to turn a potential enemy into a son-in-law. It was a deeply personal form of international relations. A princess, often a noblewoman from a lesser branch of the imperial family, would be sent hundreds of miles away from home to a completely foreign culture, all in the name of securing peace for the empire. These were incredibly difficult lives. These women were political pawns, but many of them became skilled diplomats in their own right. They had to navigate a new language, new customs, and complex court politics. They served as a bridge between two cultures, and their letters back to the imperial court provided invaluable intelligence about the nomadic world. While the long-term success of the *HUIN* policy is debated by historians, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. It highlights the incredible lengths both sides would go to find alternatives to war. It shows that diplomacy wasn't just about treaties and gifts. It was about human connection, sacrifice, and the complex, often tragic, intersection of the personal and the political. So when we look back at the long history between China and the nomads, it's crucial to see beyond the battlefield. The story is just as much about the trader bartering for a horse, the diplomat presenting a bolt of silk, and the princess starting a new life on the vast open steppe. These encounters, driven by mutual need and a desire for stability, created a unique and dynamic frontier society. It was a world where cultures didn't just clash. They met, mingled, and forever changed one another. This constant exchange of goods, ideas, and even people is a testament to the fact that even in times of great conflict, humanity's drive to connect and cooperate can create the most extraordinary and unexpected histories. Imagine waking before the sun, the air crisp and cold, the first light painting the vast, open plains in hues of gold and purple. For a farming family living in the shadow of the Great Wall, the day began with the sounds of life, the lowing of cattle, the crowing of roosters, the gentle murmur of a family preparing for a day of toil. Their existence was tied to the rhythm of the seasons, a cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting that was both their sustenance and their sacred duty. These weren't just ordinary farms. Security was paramount. You'd see homes built with defense in mind, thick, rammed earth walls, small windows set high off the ground, and a central courtyard where livestock could be quickly herded to safety. Many villages were fortified, essentially becoming mini fortresses, often clustered near a military garrison for mutual protection. This was a landscape where a farmer had to be as skilled with a hoe as they were watchful of the horizon. Every member of the family, from the youngest child to the eldest grandparent, had a role to play in this collective vigilance. The children, while helping with lighter chores, like feeding chickens or gathering kindling, were taught from a young age to recognize the signs of trouble, a distant plume of dust, the unusual behavior of animals, or the faint glint of sun on metal from the distant hills. The women managed the household, tended the kitchen gardens, spun thread, and preserved the harvest, all while keeping a constant watchful eye on their surroundings. Their resilience was the bedrock of the community. And men, meanwhile, worked the fields. Their hands, calloused and strong, guided plows through the often difficult soil. The climate on the frontier was harsh, scorching summers, bone-chilling winters, and unpredictable rainfall. Survival depended on ingenuity. These farmers were masters of adaptation. They developed drought-resistant strains of millet and wheat, built intricate irrigation channels to divert precious water from mountain streams, and mastered techniques like terracing to cultivate the steep hillsides. They learned to read the land, to understand its moods and its limits. This was a partnership, a relationship of respect and necessity between the people and the earth. This agricultural work wasn't just about feeding their own families. These farmers were the lifeblood of the frontier defenses. The vast armies stationed along the Great Wall needed a constant supply of food, fodder for their horses, and other resources. Without the surplus grain and livestock produced by these settlers, the garrisons couldn't have been maintained. The farmer's harvest was as vital to the defense of the empire as the soldier's spear. This created a symbiotic relationship. The soldiers protected the farmers from raids, and the farmers, in turn, fed the soldiers. They were two sides of the same coin, both essential for holding the line. But the threat was never far away. Life could be shattered in an instant. Imagine the scene: a lookout, perched on a simple earthen tower at the edge of the village, spots the telltale cloud of dust on the horizon. A cry of alarm rings out, sharp and urgent, cutting through the peaceful rhythm of the day. The sound is a jolt of pure adrenaline. Instantly, the field's empty. Men grab whatever makeshift weapons are at hand. Women hurry children and livestock into the fortified courtyards, and the village gates are barred. The air grows thick with tension, the silence broken only by the frantic bleating of sheep and the hushed prayers of the terrified. For those moments, which could stretch into agonizing hours, the world shrank to the space within their walls. They would listen, straining to hear the thunder of hooves, the war cries of raiders. Sometimes the alarm was false. The dust cloud would dissipate, or turn out to be a harmless merchant caravan. A collective sigh of relief would ripple through the village, and life would cautiously resume, the lingering fear a bitter taste in their mouths. Other times, the raiders would come. The clash would be brutal and swift. These farmers, fighting for their homes, their families, and the fruits of their labor, would stand alongside the local militia. They fought with a desperation born of having everything to lose. The goal of the raiders was often not conquest, but plunder, to steal grain, livestock, and people. The aftermath of a raid was devastating. Homes would be burned, granaries emptied, and loved ones lost or captured. Yet the most remarkable thing about these frontier communities was their ability to endure. After a raid, they would mourn their losses, but they would also begin to rebuild, almost immediately. They would clear the debris, repair the walls, and replant the fields. Their resilience was extraordinary. It had to be. To give up meant abandoning their land, their history, and their vital role in the empire's grand strategy. They were bound to this place by generations of sweat, sacrifice, and an unyielding will to survive. Their lives were a testament to human fortitude. They were the unsung heroes of the Great Wall, the quiet foundation upon which the monumental defense was built. Their daily struggles, their agricultural innovations, and their unwavering spirit were as much a part of the wall's story as the stones themselves. They were the pioneers who transformed a dangerous, untamed frontier into a home, proving that the strength of a nation lies not just in its armies, but in the resilience of its ordinary people. What does it truly mean to belong? For us, living in established nations, the answer might seem simple. But what if you lived on the very edge of a colossal empire, a place where borders weren't just lines on a map, but ever-shifting tides of culture, power, and identity? Welcome to the Borderlands, The fascinating, fluid frontiers where loyalties were as complex as the people who lived there. Imagine standing in a marketplace. To your left, you hear the harsh, guttural commands of an imperial legionary. To your right, the melodic dialect of the local tribespeople. You understand both perfectly. Perhaps your father was a soldier from the heart of the empire, stationed here decades ago, who fell in love with your mother, a woman from a proud local clan. Who are you? Are you a citizen of the empire, entitled to its protections but subject to its taxes and laws? Or are you one of the free people of the hills, bound by ancient customs and blood ties? The truth is, you're both and neither. This was the daily reality for countless individuals in the Borderlands. They were the human bridges between worlds, often caught in a precarious balancing act. Choosing a side wasn't just a matter of preference. It was a matter of survival. When the empire was strong and its armies marched, pledging allegiance could bring trade, security, and a measure of prosperity. Roman citizenship, for example, was a powerful tool of assimilation, offering legal rights and social mobility. To be a Roman citizen on the fringe of the empire was to be part of something vast and seemingly eternal. But what happened when the empire's grip weakened? When legions were recalled to deal with internal strife, or when a powerful new chieftain united the barbarian tribes? Suddenly, that imperial identity could become a liability. Your neighbors, who once traded with you, might now see you as a collaborator, a traitor to your own kin. The pressure to switch allegiances could be immense, driven not by a lack of principle, but by the practical need to protect your family and your home. Let's look at the story of Arminius, a figure who perfectly embodies this struggle. Born a nobleman of the Germanic Carusi tribe, he was taken to Rome as a hostage, a common practice to ensure a tribe's loyalty. He was educated in Rome, learned Latin, served in the Roman military, and was even granted Roman citizenship and equestrian rank. He was, by all appearances, a model of successful integration. But when he returned to his homeland in Germania, he saw the heavy hand of Roman rule oppressing his people. Faced with a choice, Arminius made a decision that would echo through history. He used his intimate knowledge of Roman military tactics to secretly forge a coalition of Germanic tribes. In 09 AD, in the Teutoburg forest, he led this alliance to a devastating ambush, annihilating 3 entire Roman legions. To the Romans, he was the ultimate traitor, a man who betrayed their trust and everything they had given him. But to his own people, he was a liberator, a hero who cast off the shackles of foreign domination. Was he a Roman or a German? The answer depends entirely on who you ask. His story is a stark reminder that identity in the Borderlands was never black and white. This constant push and pull created a unique cultural crucible. People in these regions didn't just choose one identity over the other. They often blended them. They might worship Roman gods alongside their traditional deities. They might speak a pidgin language, a mix of Latin and their native tongue. Their art, their clothing, their very way of life became a hybrid, a testament to their position between worlds. These weren't confused or watered-down cultures. They were new, dynamic, and incredibly resilient cultures forged in the fire of the frontier. Think about the food they ate. It might be a stew made with local vegetables and grains, but seasoned with spices brought along Roman trade routes. Or the pottery they used, crafted in a local style, but using Roman kill techniques for greater durability. Every object, every custom, told a story of interaction, adaptation, and negotiation. These people weren't passive recipients of imperial culture. They were active participants, selecting, rejecting, and remixing elements to create something that worked for them, something that was uniquely their own. The political landscape was just as fluid. Local leaders became masters of diplomacy and opportunism. They might pledge fealty to the emperor one year, receiving gold and titles in return for keeping the peace. The next, they might be raiding imperial supply lines if they felt slighted or saw an opportunity for gain. This wasn't necessarily treachery. It was a high-stakes game of survival. They were playing the long game, their ultimate allegiance not to a distant emperor or a vague tribal confederation, but to their own people, their own lineage, and their own patch of land. The empire, for its part, often understood and even encouraged this ambiguity. It was cheaper to pay a local chieftain to guard a frontier than to station expensive legions there permanently. These client kings and buffer states served a vital purpose, absorbing the first shock of any invasion and managing the complex local politics that the empire couldn't be bothered with. The border was a membrane, not a wall, and both sides knew it. So, when we look back at these great empires, let's not forget the people on the edge. They were not simply footnotes in the grand narrative of conquest and glory. They were the ones living the consequences, navigating the complexities, and forging new ways of being in a world defined by conflict and connection. Their loyalties were not fickle. They were strategic. Their identities were not confused. They were layered and rich. They show us that identity is never static, and that belonging is often a story we must write for ourselves, especially when we live on the borderlands between worlds. All right, let's journey back in time to the mighty rivers that marked the edge of the Roman world, the Rhine and the Danube. For centuries, these weren't just rivers. They were the lifeblood and the backbone of the limes Germanicus and the limes Riesi, Rome's most extensive European frontier. This wasn't a wall of stone like Hadrian's, but a dynamic, living border defined by the currents of the water and the presence of thousands of legionaries and auxiliaries. Picture this. You're standing on the banks of the Danube at dawn. The morning mist is lifting off the water, and through it, you can just make out the silhouettes of watchtowers, spaced methodically along the river's edge. You hear the rhythmic tramp of a patrol as hobnailed sandals on the packed earth of the riverbank path, their armor glinting in the rising sun. They aren't just marching. They're the eyes and ears of an empire, a constant, visible deterrent to any tribes thinking of crossing from the Barbaricum. This river frontier was a masterpiece of logistics. The Rhine and Danube were, first and foremost, superhighways. Forget dusty, winding roads. The rivers offered the most efficient way to move men, food, and materials. Imagine the constant traffic. Long, slender patrol boats, the Liburne, sliced through the water, propelled by the steady rhythm of oars. Behind them, larger, heavier transport barges, laden with grain, wine, weapons, and leather, are poled or towed upstream, fighting the current to resupply the garrisons. The sounds would be a symphony of effort. The splash of oars, the shouts of sailors, the creak of wood, and the lowing of cattle being transported to feed the legions. This was the logistical heartbeat of the frontier, a never-ending chain that kept the military machine running. And where there are soldiers, there are forts. Along these rivers, a chain of forts and fortresses housed the troops. These weren't just crude wooden stockades. We're talking about sophisticated military installations. From the massive legionary fortresses like Carnuntum or Mogontiacum, which were practically cities in their own right, to the smaller auxiliary forts or castella. Each was a hub of Roman engineering and discipline. Within their walls, life followed a strict routine. The Principia, or headquarters, stood at the center. Nearby were the granaries, or horia, with their raised floors to keep supplies dry and safe from pests. A simple but brilliant piece of engineering. Barrack blocks housed the soldiers, 8 men to a room, in a space that was both their sleeping quarters and their home. Life in these forts was a mix of intense discipline and mundane routine. A soldier's day might start with a morning parade, followed by hours of weapons training practicing with the gladius, hurling the pilum. Then there were the work duties, repairing equipment, maintaining the fort's defenses, or standing guard duty on the walls, staring out across the river into the dense forests of Germania. But it wasn't all work. In the evenings, soldiers might gather in the barracks to gamble with dice. WRITE, letters home on thin wooden tablets, or visit the bathhouse just outside the fort's walls for a bit of relaxation and socializing. These bathhouses were crucial social centers, places to wash away the grime of the day and catch up on the latest gossip. Outside the walls of the forts, a civilian settlement of Vicus would almost inevitably spring up. This is where the story of the frontier gets really interesting. Here, merchants, artisans, innkeepers, and the unofficial families of the soldiers lived. The wiki were bustling, multicultural communities. You'd find a blacksmith shoeing a cavalry horse, a trader selling pottery from Gaul, and a woman weaving cloth to sell to the soldiers. These settlements were the connective tissue between the military and the local population, places where cultures met, mingled, and sometimes clashed. They were a testament to the fact that wherever the Roman army went, Roman civilization, in its own unique frontier form, was sure to follow. The rivers themselves presented a formidable engineering challenge. How do you control a border that's hundreds of miles long and made of flowing water? The Romans had answers. They built incredible timber and stone bridges, like the famous Trajan's Bridge across the Danube, a marvel of engineering that stood for centuries. These bridges weren't just for crossing. They were statements of power, projections of Roman might deep into enemy territory. Where bridges weren't practical, a fleet of boats, the Classis Germanica and Classis Pannonica, patrolled the waters, acting as a riverine navy to intercept raiders and control traffic. But the river wasn't just a barrier. It was a membrane. It was a place of exchange. Not all interactions with the tribes on the other side were hostile. Designated crossing points allowed for controlled trade. Amber, furs, and slaves flowed into the empire, while Roman wine, glassware, and pottery flowed out. This trade was a tool of Roman foreign policy, a way to create dependency and foster alliances with friendly tribes, creating a buffer zone of clients and allies. The frontier was less a hard line and more a gradient of Roman influence, fading slowly as one moved away from the riverbank. So, when we look at the Rhine and Danube, we're not just seeing rivers. We're seeing the strategic and logistical genius of Rome in action. We're seeing a dynamic, multicultural world where soldiers, sailors, merchants, and local tribes lived side by side. It was a frontier that relied not on static walls, but on the control of the water, the strength of its forts, and the relentless efficiency of its supply lines. It was here, along these great European rivers, that the Roman Empire truly flexed its muscles, holding the line for centuries and shaping the future of the continent. Let's journey beyond the Roman Empire's borders, across the mighty Rhine and Danube rivers. Here, shrouded in dense, mist-laden forests and sprawling swamps, lies a land the Romans called Germania. This wasn't an empire of marble cities, but a mosaic of fierce, independent peoples, the Germanic tribes. Forget everything you think you know about barbarians. We're about to uncover a world rich in culture, deeply connected to the earth, and defined by a formidable warrior spirit. Imagine stepping into this ancient world. The air is thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. You don't see sprawling cities, but scattered villages of longhouses, built from the very timber of the forest that surrounds them. Life here is raw, dictated by the seasons. The rhythm of the day is marked by the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, forging not just tools, but swords and spearheads. You hear the lowing of cattle, the calls of hunters returning with game, and the murmur of a guttural language that would one day evolve into modern German, English, and Dutch. The forest was their fortress, their pantry, and their sacred temple all in one. The Germanic peoples were masters of this environment. They hunted deer, boar, and bear, not just for food, but for skins and bone. Their agriculture was simpler than Rome's vast latifundia, focused on hardy grains like barley and rye, cultivated in clearings carved out of the woods. This intimate connection to the land shaped their entire worldview. Their gods were woven into the fabric of nature. Woden, the All-Father, often depicted wandering the wild. Gunnar, whose hammer blow was the thunder that echoed through the trees. Sacred groves, ancient trees, and bubbling springs were their places of worship, far more meaningful than any man-made temple. At the heart of every Germanic community was the tribe, a web of kinship and loyalty. Leadership wasn't inherited by divine right, but earned through charisma, wisdom, and above all, martial prowess. The most important gatherings were the tribal assemblies, or things. Here, under the open sky, free warriors would gather to make laws, decide on war and peace, and elect their chieftains. Picture it, the clash of spears against shields, a raucous form of voting that signaled their approval of a leader's proposal. It was a form of direct democracy, boisterous and primal, that stood in stark contrast to the intricate bureaucracy of Rome. And what about their famous warrior culture? It wasn't just about aggression. It was a code of honor. For a young Germanic man, the greatest ambition was to join a war band, a asterisk comitatus asterisk, sworn to a charismatic leader. This bond was absolute. The chieftain fought for victory, and his followers fought for him. To survive a battle where your chief had fallen was the ultimate disgrace, a stain on your honor that would last a lifetime. This loyalty created some of the most formidable fighting units of the ancient world. Their weapons were simple but effective. The deadly throwing spear, known as the asterisk fremia asterisk, a sturdy shield, and for the wealthiest warriors, a long-bladed sword, a symbol of immense prestige. They were not a mindless horde. The Romans, with their rigid legions, often found themselves at a complete loss in the dense forests of Germania. The Germanic tribes were masters of guerrilla warfare. They used the terrain to their advantage, launching sudden, brutal ambushes from the cover of the trees, striking hard and fast before melting back into the shadows. Their raids were not just for plunder. They were a way of life, a means to gain wealth, prestige, and captives. These weren't grand campaigns of conquest in the Roman style, but lightning-fast strikes across the frontier to test defenses and acquire resources. This constant pressure on the Rhine and Danube frontiers became a defining feature of the later Roman Empire. For centuries, it was a cycle of raid and reprisal. Roman legions would march into Germania to punish a tribe, often burning villages and taking captives, only for the tribes to retaliate weeks or months later. The Romans built extensive fortifications, the asterisk limes Germanicus asterisk, a massive wall and ditch system, to try and contain this threat. But it was like trying to dam a river with a leaky wall. The pressure was relentless. This wasn't a simple story of civilization versus savagery. It was a clash of two profoundly different worlds. The Romans saw the Germanic peoples as unpredictable and wild, a force of nature to be tamed. The Germanic tribes saw the Romans as an encroaching power, a threat to their freedom and their way of life. They admired Roman wealth and technology, eagerly trading for it, but they fiercely resisted Roman control. This complex relationship of conflict, trade, and cultural exchange would simmer for centuries. The forests of Germania weren't just a place on a map. They were the crucible that forged a people whose fierce independence, warrior ethos, and deep connection to the land would not only challenge the might of Rome, but also lay the very foundations for the kingdoms of medieval Europe. The echoes of their guttural languages, their tribal laws, and their heroic sagas would resonate through the ages, shaping the world we live in today. From the shadowy forests across the Rhine, these tribes were a constant, powerful force, a storm gathering on the horizon of the Roman world, waiting for its moment to break. Ever wondered what life was really like on the edge of the Roman Empire? It wasn't always about epic battles and clashing armies. In fact, some of the most fascinating stories come from the bustling frontier towns along the Rhine and Danube rivers. These weren't just military outposts. They were vibrant melting pots where Romang and Germanic cultures didn't just meet, they merged. Imagine stepping into one of these towns, a place buzzing with energy, a crossroads of civilizations. This is where the story of empire gets truly interesting, not as a tale of conquest, but as a story of connection and creation. Today, we're journeying back in time to explore these unique hybrid societies, where new worlds were forged in the spaces between. Let's set the scene. For centuries, the mighty Rhine and Danube rivers formed the northern limes, the fortified border of the Romang Empire. On one side, you had the structured, urbanized world of Rome, with its legions, laws, and Latin. On the other, the diverse and so-called barbarian Germanic tribes, with their own rich traditions and societal structures. But this line wasn't a wall. It was a permeable membrane, a zone of constant interaction. And right along this line, towns sprang up, places like Colonia Claudia, Era Agrippinensium, modern-day Cologne, or Carnuntum in present-day Austria. These weren't just Roman garrisons. They were magnets for trade, opportunity, and people from every walk of life. Picture a marketplace in one of these frontier towns. The air is thick with 100 different smells. Roman wine and olive oil, exotic spices from the east, alongside the earthy scent of local amber, furs, and leather brought by Germanic traders. You'd hear a babble of languages. A Roman quartermaster haggles in broken Germanic for a supply of cattle to feed the legion. A Germanic chieftain's daughter, adorned in both a Roman-style fibula brooch and traditional amber beads, examines fine Samian-ware pottery from Gaul. This wasn't a clash of civilizations. It was a bustling, dynamic exchange. Roman merchants sought valuable raw materials and recruits for the army, while Germanic peoples desired the prestige and practicality of Roman goods, glassware, metal tools, and of course, currency. This constant flow of goods was the lifeblood of the frontier, creating mutual dependency and fostering a unique economic ecosystem. But this blending went far beyond simple trade. It seeped into the very fabric of daily life, and we can see it in the ground thanks to archaeology. Excavations in these areas unearth fascinating objects that tell a story of cultural fusion. For instance, archaeologists find Roman-style villas built with local timber framing techniques. They uncover pottery that uses traditional Germanic forms, but is made with a Roman potter see wheel and kill. It's the best of both worlds. This shows us that people weren't just trading items, they were trading ideas and skills. A Roman soldier might adopt a warmer, more practical Germanic cloak, while a local craftsperson might incorporate a Roman decorative motif, like a vine scroll, into a piece of traditional jewelry. These objects are tangible proof of a shared world, where people picked and chose elements from different cultures to create something new and uniquely their own. Art and personal adornment are some of the most powerful indicators of this cultural hybridity. Take the brooches or fibulae used to fasten clothing. We find designs that are unmistakably Roman in their craftsmanship, but feature animal motifs like eagles, boars, and stags that held deep significance in Germanic cosmology. It's a visual conversation between two different symbolic languages. A Roman eagle might be stylized in a way that feels distinctly non-classical, more abstract and energetic, reflecting a Germanic aesthetic. This wasn't a case of one culture overpowering the other. It was a creative dialogue. People on the frontier were expressing a new blended identity through the things they wore. They were Roman citizens, perhaps, but also people of the Rhine or the Danube, and their art reflected that complex reality. Language and belief systems were also in a state of flux. While Latin was the official language of administration and the military, a simplified vulgar Latin was spoken in the streets, peppered with Germanic words and phrases. Inscriptions found on tombstones show this mix. You might see a person with a Celtic or Germanic name, like Boudica or Frederick, commemorated with a traditional Roman funerary formula. This tells us that people could hold multiple identities at once. They might adopt a Roman name for official purposes, but use their birth name within their family and community. This linguistic code switching was a daily reality. The same was true for religion. Roman gods were worshipped alongside local deities. A Roman soldier stationed far from home might make an offering to a local river god to ensure safe passage, while a Germanic auxiliary soldier might equate his tribe's sky god with the Roman Jupiter. Temples have been found where dedications are made to gods with combined names, like Mars Dingsus, a fusion of the Roman god of war Mars and the Germanic god of the assembly, Tyr, known as Dingsus. This religious syncretism wasn't a compromise. It was a sophisticated way of understanding the world. It allowed diverse peoples to find common ground in the spiritual realm, creating shared sacred spaces where everyone, regardless of origin, could seek divine favor. It shows a remarkable level of tolerance and adaptation. What drove this incredible fusion? It was a combination of factors. The long-term presence of the Roman army was key. Soldiers, many of whom were not Italian but from other provinces, settled down, married local women, and raised families. Their children were born into this mixed world, fluent in its customs and languages. These veterans, upon retirement, were often granted land and citizenship, becoming influential members of their communities and acting as cultural bridges. They were living proof that you could be both Roman and something else entirely. Economic opportunity was another huge driver. The frontier was a place where you could make a fortune, and wealth often erases cultural boundaries. Success in trade or in service to the empire brought people together, creating a new elite class whose status was based on prosperity and Roman connections, not just tribal lineage. So, these frontier towns were far more than just defensive lines on a map. They were social laboratories, crucibles of culture where assimilation and innovation went hand in hand. They challenged the simplistic narrative of Romans versus barbarians. The reality was far more nuanced, more complex, and frankly, more human. It was a story of neighbors, trading partners, spouses, and comrades in arms. The people living on the Rhine-Danube frontier weren't just passively receiving Roman culture. They were actively shaping it, adapting it, and creating new, vibrant hybrid traditions that were entirely their own. This process of cultural blending demonstrates a fundamental truth about human history. Contact between different peoples, while sometimes leading to conflict, more often results in creativity, adaptation, and the birth of new identities. The legacy of these frontier towns is a powerful reminder that our world has always been shaped by exchange and fusion. We're diving into the ingenious communication network that kept the empire safe, the watchtowers, and signal systems. How did Rome maintain control over a border that stretched for thousands of kilometers? It wasn't just with swords and shields, but with information. Speed was everything. Look around this reconstructed watchtower. These structures, often built from timber and earth, dotted the landscape every few kilometers. They were the eyes and ears of the limes. From up here, a sentry had a commanding view of the river and the lands beyond, the Arbericum asterisk. His primary duty wasn't to fight, but to see, to spot any unusual movement, a gathering of tribes, a fleet of boats, anything that deviated from the daily rhythm of the frontier. Once a threat was spotted, the clock started ticking. There was no time to send a rider. Instead, the sentry would use a system of signals that was both simple and brilliant. By day, it was smoke. A thick, dark plume of smoke rising into the sky was an unmistakable sign of alarm. Think of it as an ancient emergency broadcast. Each tower was in visual range of the next one, down the line. A signal lit at one tower would be seen and then replicated by the next, and the next, and the next, sending a wave of information, cascading along the frontier at the speed of sight. But what about at night? When darkness shrouded the river valley, fire became the messenger. A blazing beacon lit atop the tower would cut through the blackness, a fiery star carrying a warning. The Romans even developed coded systems. Different numbers or patterns of fires could convey more specific messages, perhaps indicating the size of the enemy force or the direction of their approach. It was a surprisingly sophisticated system for its time. These visual signals were often complemented by sound. Imagine the piercing blast of the asterisk cornu asterisk, a large G-shaped brass horn. Its mournful, powerful sound could travel for miles, echoing through the valleys and alerting nearby patrols and forts. The asterisk tuba asterisk, a long, straight trumpet, would have added to the symphony of warning. These weren't just musical instruments. They were vital tools of military command and control, relaying orders and sounding the alarm long before an enemy was in sight. This network connected the small watchtowers to larger auxiliary forts and, ultimately, to the major legionary fortresses stationed further behind the line. A signal from the frontier could trigger a rapid response. Within minutes of a signal being sent, soldiers in a nearby fort would be arming themselves. Cavalry patrols, the rapid reaction force of the limes, would be saddling up, ready to ride towards the point of incursion. This system turned the limes from a simple static barrier into a dynamic, responsive defense network. The efficiency of this communication web was a testament to Roman engineering and strategic planning. They understood that defending such a vast border wasn't just about building walls. It was about creating a nervous system for the frontier, one that could detect a problem and dispatch a solution with incredible speed. It required constant vigilance, discipline, and trust. The sentry in the tower had to be alert. His counterpart in the next tower had to be watching, and the commanders in the forts had to be ready to act on the information they received. It's this human element that truly brings the system to life. Picture the tension, the long hours of staring into the misty horizon, knowing that the safety of thousands depended on your sharp eyes and quick actions. These weren't just structures of wood and stone. They were manned by dedicated soldiers who formed the living, breathing communication line of the Roman Empire. Their watchfulness was the invisible shield that protected the peace and prosperity within. Join us next time as we step inside the forts themselves to see what daily life was like for the soldiers who lived and worked on the edge of the world. The story of the limes is far from over. In our last segment, we saw the legions, the forts, the grand imperial strategy. But today, we're shifting our focus from the eagle standards and marching boots to the calloused hands and weathered faces of the people who truly lived with the river day in and day out, the farmers and the fishermen. For them, these mighty waterways weren't just a border. They were the source of life itself. So let's step away from the forts and into the fields. Picture this. The sun is rising, casting a golden glow across the water, and the morning mist is clinging to the fertile riverbanks. Here, in the shadow of Roman power, life unfolds at a different rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the flow of the river. For both the Roman settlers, perhaps retired legionaries, granted a plot of land, and the indigenous communities who had been here for generations, the soil was everything. The land along the Rhine and Danube was incredibly fertile, enriched by centuries of river deposits. This was prime real estate for agriculture. Communities cultivated a variety of crops. Wheat and barley were staples, providing the grain for bread and a thick, porridge-like stew called pulse that was a cornerstone of the daily diet. They also grew legumes like lentils and beans, which were a crucial source of protein, especially when meat was scarce. And of course, there were the vegetables. Cabbages, onions, turnips, and leafy greens filled the kitchen gardens that were tended with meticulous care, usually by the women and children of the household. Farming techniques were a fascinating blend of old and new. Indigenous groups like the Celts and Germans had their own long-established agricultural traditions. perfectly adapted to the local climate. They used lightweight plows, often pulled by a pair of oxen, to turn the soil. The Romans, however, brought with them their own innovations. They introduced more advanced, heavier iron plows that could break up tougher soil more efficiently. They were masters of land management, introducing crop rotation to prevent soil exhaustion and using manure from their livestock to fertilize the fields. You can imagine a Roman veteran who had marched across half the known world, now teaching his new indigenous neighbors about the benefits of letting a field lie fallow for a season. Life was governed by the agricultural calendar. Spring was a frenzy of activity, plowing and sowing seeds, praying for the right amount of rain. Summer was a time of anxious waiting and constant weeding, watching the crops grow under the long, warm sun. The real climax of the year was the autumn harvest. The entire community would come together, a collective effort to bring in the grain before the first frosts. It was back-breaking work, cutting the stalks with iron sickles, binding them into sheaves, and threshing the grain to separate it from the chaff. But it was also a time of celebration, of relief, knowing that the storehouses were full and the community would be fed through the long, cold winter. These farms weren't just crop fields. They were vibrant ecosystems. Livestock was just as important as grain. Cattle were prized possessions, providing not only meat and milk for cheese and butter, but also the raw muscle power for plowing. Sheep were raised for their wool, which was spun and woven into the coarse, warm textiles needed to survive the chilly northern winters. Pigs, which could forage for themselves in the nearby forests, were a vital source of meat, easily preserved as bacon or sausage. And nearly every household kept chickens, providing a steady supply of eggs. The sounds of the farm would have been a constant backdrop to life. The lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the clucking of hens, the symphony of a self-sufficient world. Now, let's turn our gaze from the fields to the water itself. If the land provided bread, the river provided another kind of bounty. For the fishermen of the Rhine and Danube, the river was their farm. These waters teemed with life. Huge sturgeon, prized for their roe, migrated up the river to spawn. Pike, carp, perch, and massive catfish, some reputedly growing to incredible sizes, filled the nets of those who knew where to look. Salmon runs would have been a spectacular sight, a silver torrent fighting its way upstream. The methods they used were ingenious and varied, passed down through generations. Fishermen would cast large nets from small, sturdy boats, often simple dugout canoes or plank-built vessels sealed with pitch. They would work in teams, one boat holding one end of the net while another circled around to trap a school of fish. For a more passive approach, they would set up intricate fish traps and weirs. Imagine a series of wooden stakes driven into the riverbed, forming a V-shape that funneled fish into a trap at the point. These were permanent structures that required constant maintenance, but could yield a reliable catch with less daily effort. They also used fishing spears, especially in the shallower sections, and lines with hooks baited with worms or smaller fish. Every eddy, every deep pool, every bend in the river was a known fishing spot with its own secrets. The life of a fisherman was one of patience and deep knowledge. They had to understand the river's currents, its moods, the seasonal habits of the fish. They knew that after a heavy rain, when the river was murky, certain fish were easier to catch. They could read the surface of the water for signs of activity below. This wasn't just a job. It was an intimate relationship with the river. You can almost hear the rhythmic splash of oars in the pre-dawn light, the calls of waterfowl echoing. Across the water, the quiet concentration of a man mending his net on the riverbank, his hands moving with practiced unthinking skill. This river bounty wasn't just for local consumption. Fish was a valuable trade good. It could be smoked, salted, or dried to preserve it for transport. This preserved fish could be sold at local markets, traded with Roman soldiers in the nearby forts who craved variety in their rations, or even shipped further into the interior of the empire. Archaeologists have found evidence of fish processing stations along the riverbanks, with remains of smoking huts and large quantities of fish bones, proof of a thriving local industry. So the humble fisherman casting his net in the Danube was a small but vital part of the vast Roman economic machine. But life on the river wasn't always idyllic. These were dynamic and sometimes dangerous frontiers. The same river that provided sustenance could also bring disaster. A sudden spring flood, fed by melting snow in the mountains, could surge over the banks, washing away crops, drowning livestock, and destroying homes. A harsh winter could freeze the river solid, cutting off transport and making fishing impossible. And of course, this was a contested border. The threat of raids from across the river was ever present. A farmer working his field or a fisherman in his boat always had one eye on the far bank, listening for any sign of trouble. Their lives were a delicate balance between the river's generosity and its potential for fury, between peaceful coexistence and sudden conflict. For these communities, the river was the central artery of their world. It was their highway, with small boats and barges moving people and goods between settlements. It was their water source for drinking, cooking, and washing. It was their calendar, its seasonal floods and freezes marking the passage of the year. It was their larder, providing both fish from its depths and fertile soil on its banks. It was a place of work, of sustenance, of danger, and of profound beauty. The daily lives of these farmers and fishermen, a blend of Roman and indigenous traditions, represent the true, living heart of the frontier. They were the ones who turned a military border into a vibrant, populated landscape, their lives and destinies forever intertwined with the great rivers, the Rhine and the Danube. This was a frontier unlike any other, a world of sun-baked forts, shimmering mirages, and resilient soldiers holding the line against the unknown. Imagine standing on the battlements of a Roman fort, not looking out at green hills, but at an ocean of golden dunes stretching to the horizon. The air isn't filled with the scent of pine, but with the dry, dusty heat of the desert. These outposts, known as Castra or Castella, were lonely sentinels in the sand, strategically placed to guard vital caravan routes and, most importantly, the scarce and precious water sources that meant life or death in this arid land. These weren't the massive legionary fortresses you might picture. Many were smaller, more isolated strongholds, built from local materials, mud brick and stone, that blended into the landscape. They were dots on a map, connected by faint trails and the courage of the men who patrolled them. Life here was a masterclass in adaptation. The creak of Roman leather sandals was joined by the jingle of camel bells, as the army learned to use the ships of the desert for patrols and logistics, a skill borrowed from the very people they were watching. The daily routine was dictated by the sun. The scorching midday heat would bring activity to a near standstill, with soldiers seeking whatever shade they could find. The real work happened in the cooler hours of the morning and evening. Patrols would set out, not just looking for enemies, but ensuring the safety of traders and travelers. These routes were the arteries of the empire, carrying exotic goods like ivory, gold, and wild animals for the amphitheaters back in Rome. Protecting them was crucial for the economy and prestige of the empire. The soldiers stationed here were often auxiliaries, recruited from North Africa and other provinces. They were men who understood the land, who could read the shifting sands and the subtle signs of a coming sandstorm. They were experts in survival. Their diet would have been different too, relying on hardy grains, dates, and whatever could be raised or traded locally. Water was rationed with extreme care, stored in cisterns beneath the forts, a treasure more valuable than gold. One of the greatest challenges was simply staying supplied. Imagine the logistical nightmare of transporting food, weapons, and wine hundreds of miles across a barren wasteland. Supply columns were slow, vulnerable, and a tempting target for raiders. The loss of a single supply convoy could spell disaster for an isolated garrison. This constant vulnerability bred a unique kind of soldier, vigilant, resourceful, and incredibly tough. And the threat was very real. Beyond the Roman sphere of influence were nomadic tribes like the Garamantes, masters of desert warfare. They were fierce raiders who could appear as if from nowhere, strike fast on their swift camels, and vanish back into the dunes before a proper defense could be mustered. They didn't seek to conquer Roman territory in a conventional sense. They sought plunder goods, supplies, and captives. For a Roman soldier, the enemy wasn't just a man with a spear. It was the sun itself, the thirst, the biting sand carried on the wind, and the profound, unnerving silence of the desert night. The psychological toll of this isolation must have been immense. Far from the comforts of a Roman city, far from home, these men stood guard in a truly alien environment. Their world was one of dusty horizons, of camaraderie forged in shared hardship, and of the constant, quiet vigilance required to survive. These desert garrisons were true tests of human endurance. The men who served here weren't just soldiers. They were pioneers, diplomats, and survivalists, all rolled into one. They interacted with local tribes, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting, in a complex dance of power and necessity. They learned to respect the desert, understanding that it was an enemy more powerful than any human foe. Think about the discipline required to maintain Roman standards in such a place. To keep armor polished when sand got into everything. To drill in formation under a relentless sun. To hold the line day after day, year after year, so far from the heart of the empire. This wasn't a glorious posting for ambitious generals, but it was essential. These forts were the anchors that secured the empire's southern flank, protecting the wealthy coastal provinces of Africa Proconsularis from chaos. Many of these forts grew over time. Around their walls, small civilian settlements called *wiki* would spring up, populated by merchants, craftsmen, veterans, and their families. These were vibrant, multicultural communities, where Latin mixed with local Berber languages, creating a unique Romano-African culture. You can still see the ruins of these outposts today, places like Gemelli in Algeria or Girit el Garbia in Libya, their stone walls slowly being reclaimed by the sand. Walking through these ruins, you can almost feel the ghosts of the legionaries. You can picture them scanning the horizon, listening for the faint sound of approaching camels, or sharing a rough meal with their comrades. They were the unsung heroes of the empire, the men who guarded the edge of the world. Their story isn't one of grand battles and triumphal arches, but of quiet resilience and the enduring strength of the human spirit against the harshest of elements. These forts in the sand represent a fascinating chapter in Roman history. They show an empire that was not just a conqueror, but also an adapter, capable of projecting its power into even the most inhospitable environments on earth. The legacy of these soldiers is written not in grand histories, but in the scattered stones of their lonely outposts, a testament to their incredible fortitude, and a reminder that the borders of an empire are held not just by walls, but by the will of those who stand upon them. Stepping away from the stone and mortar of Roman cities, let's journey into the vast, shimmering expanse of the Sahara. This wasn't an empty wasteland to the Romans. It was a vibrant, dynamic frontier, home to peoples who had mastered the desert long before the first legionary set foot in Africa. These were the indigenous peoples of North Africa, often collectively known as the Berbers, and among them, one group stood out for their power and sophistication, the Garamantes. Forget the Roman stereotype of disorganized nomads. These were the true masters of the desert. Their world was one of constant movement, a life dictated by the seasons, the availability of water, and the needs of their herds. Imagine the sight, a caravan of camels, the ships of the desert, silhouetted against a dune at sunset, their riders wrapped in flowing robes to protect against the relentless sun and sand. These weren't just random wanderings. The Berber and Garamantes tribes possessed an intimate ancestral knowledge of the land. They knew the location of every hidden oasis, every secret spring, and every navigable path through the seemingly featureless terrain. This knowledge was their greatest asset, a map etched not on parchment, but in their collective memory, passed down through generations in stories, songs, and chants. Their languages, part of the Afro-Asiatic family, would have filled the desert air with sounds utterly alien to Latin ears, a testament to a deep and ancient cultural heritage. The Garamantes, in particular, established a formidable kingdom centered in what is modern-day Libya. They weren't just nomads. They were brilliant engineers. Their capital, Jerma, was the heart of a sophisticated civilization that thrived by harnessing the desert's most precious resource, water. They constructed an incredible network of underground irrigation channels called fogaras. These were tunnels, sometimes miles long, dug deep into the earth to tap into fossil aquifers. This ancient water, trapped underground for millennia, was channeled to the surface, transforming arid valleys into lush, green oases. These man-made paradises supported date palms, grains, and vegetables, allowing for a settled population and a complex society to flourish. This was an astonishing feat of engineering, rivaling some of Rome's own aqueducts, but adapted perfectly to the unique challenges of the desert environment. Life in a Garamantian settlement was a blend of settled agriculture and nomadic pastoralism. While farmers tended the irrigated fields, others would lead herds of cattle, goats, and sheep to seasonal pastures. They were skilled artisans too. Archaeological finds have revealed beautiful pottery, intricate jewelry, and fine metalwork. But perhaps their most enduring legacy is their art, carved and painted onto rock faces across the Sahara. These stunning petroglyphs depict a world teeming with life. Elegant giraffes, powerful elephants, and fierce lions, animals that roamed a Sahara that was once much wetter and greener. They also show scenes of daily life, hunting parties, chariots pulled by horses, and mysterious figures with round heads, offering a silent, breathtaking window into their spiritual and cultural world. These weren't crude drawings. They were a vibrant chronicle of their history and beliefs, a desert art gallery stretching back thousands of years. The Garamantes and other Berber tribes were also the undisputed kings of trans-Saharan trade. They controlled the vital arteries of commerce that connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world. Their camel caravans were the lifeblood of this trade, undertaking perilous journeys across the vast desert. From the south, they brought gold, ivory, exotic animals for the Roman arenas, precious stones, and enslaved people. In return, they received Roman goods like wine, olive oil, glassware, and fine textiles. This trade made the Garamantian elite incredibly wealthy and powerful. They weren't just on the periphery of the Roman world. They were crucial cogs in its vast economic machine, gatekeepers to the untold riches of the African interior. Their relationship with Rome was complex and ever-shifting. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy, trade, and conflict. The Romans, ever pragmatic, recognized the Garamantes' control over the trade routes and often sought peaceful, profitable relationships. Treaties were signed and diplomatic gifts were exchanged. However, the frontier was also a place of tension. The nomadic lifestyle of many tribes inevitably led to friction with settled Roman farming communities. Raids on Roman outposts and farmsteads were common, a way for the tribes to acquire goods, assert their strength, and resist Roman encroachment. These weren't necessarily attempts at conquest, but rather a strategic part of life on the frontier, a way to maintain a balance of power. In response, Rome would launch punitive expeditions, sending legions deep into the desert to chastise the raiders. The Roman historian Tacitus records one such campaign led by Lucius Cornelius Balbus, who even captured the Garamantian capital of Jerma in 19 BC. Yet, These Roman victories were often fleeting. The tribes would simply melt away into the vastness of the Sahara, a landscape the Roman legions could never truly conquer or control. The desert itself was their greatest fortress. The Garamantes and their neighbors were resilient. They could be defeated in a battle, but their society, perfectly adapted to the desert, would always endure and bounce back. They would negotiate new treaties, trade would resume, and the cycle would begin again. This dynamic interaction shaped both sides. The Romans learned to adapt their military strategies, using more mobile camel-mounted auxiliary units, known as dromedari, to patrol the desert frontier. The Berber tribes, in turn, adopted certain Roman technologies and goods, but they fiercely maintained their own cultural identity and independence. They were never truly Romanized in the way many other peoples on the empire's borders were. They remained distinct, a powerful and independent force that Rome had to reckon with, not as subjects, but as strategic partners and formidable rivals. They were the living, breathing heart of the Sahara, a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the enduring power of a culture forged in the crucible of the world's greatest desert. The northern fringe of the Sahara was a vibrant, dynamic nexus, connecting the Roman world with the heart of Africa. It was a place of constant movement, a crossroads where different worlds didn't just meet, they mingled, traded, and transformed one another. The Romans, with their insatiable appetite for the exotic and the luxurious, looked south, and what they saw was opportunity. Picture this: long, winding caravans of camels, the ships of the desert, emerging from the shimmering heat haze. These weren't just any caravans. They were laden with treasures that would make a Roman emperor's eyes widen. We're talking about glittering gold dust, sourced from the mines of West Africa, destined for the mints and jewelers of Rome itself. Imagine magnificent ivory tusks, carved by skilled artisans into intricate statues and ornaments, adorning the villas of the wealthy. And the trade didn't stop there. The Romans had a fascination with exotic animals for their games and private menageries. These caravans brought giraffes, leopards, and ostriches across the immense desert. This was the channel through which the wonders of sub-Saharan Africa made their way to the Colosseum's floor. It was a perilous, yet immensely profitable journey. Now, who made these incredible journeys possible? The Romans themselves rarely ventured deep into the Sahara. The real masters of this domain were the desert tribes groups like the Garamantes. These people weren't just inhabitants of the desert. They were its navigators, its entrepreneurs, its gatekeepers. They knew the secret paths, the hidden wells, and the rhythms of the sands like the back of their hands. They acted as the crucial intermediaries. They would acquire goods from the African interior and transport them to the bustling market towns on the Roman frontier, places like Leptis Magna or Sabratha. In return, they'd receive Roman goods, fine pottery, glassware, wine, olive oil, and textiles. It was a classic exchange, but on an epic scale, managed by the people who understood the desert best. They were the guides, the guards, and the merchants all rolled into one. Their knowledge was the key that unlocked the continent's wealth for Rome. This constant flow of goods inevitably led to a flow of ideas, cultures, and people. The desert's edge became a unique intercultural zone. It was a place where Roman soldiers, merchants, and administrators rubbed shoulders with nomadic chieftains and traders from deep within Africa. You'd hear Latin and Punic spoken alongside a dozen different desert languages. Despite the Roman legions patrolling the frontier, this wasn't a one-sided relationship of conquest. It was a complex dance of cooperation and occasional conflict. The trade was too valuable for either side to sever the connection completely. Roman military presence provided a degree of security for the market towns, while the desert tribes controlled the supply lines. This mutual dependency fostered a unique blend of cultures. You can see it in the art, the architecture, and even the religious practices of the region, a fusion of Romang, Punic, and indigenous African traditions. Think of the desert not as a wall that separated civilizations, but as a permeable membrane through which culture and commerce flowed freely. This trade enriched Rome, empowering the desert tribes and creating a corridor of connection that spanned thousands of miles. It fundamentally shaped the economy and society of Romang, North Africa, turning its southern frontier into one of the most dynamic and cosmopolitan regions of the entire empire. So, when we look at a map and see the vast expanse of the Sahara, let's remember the stories hidden in the sand. Stories of camel caravans laden with gold, of desert kings acting as master merchants, and of a highway of commerce that connected worlds. The formidable desert was, in fact, a bridge. For centuries, across the great deserts of the world, from the Sahara to the Arabian, survival wasn't just a challenge. It was an art form. And at the heart of this art, there was one element, one resource more precious than any gold or jewel: water. Today, we journey back in time to explore the lifeline of the desert, to understand how ancient civilizations didn't just survive, but thrived in these harsh environments. This is the story of water, oases, and the ingenious people who mastered the desert. Transition to a lush, green oasis, a stark contrast to the surrounding desert. Closing parenthesis. In the endless sea of sand, an oasis is more than just a patch of green. It's a promise of life, of sustenance, of community. For both the nomadic tribes who roamed the desert and the great empires like Rome that sought to control it, oases were the anchors of existence. Everything revolved around them. They were the rest stops on grueling trade routes, the strategic military outposts, and the cradles of unique, resilient cultures. Life in an oasis was a world away from the blistering heat just beyond its borders. Here, communities didn't just exist. They flourished. Picture a village nestled amongst a grove of date palms, their fronds rustling in a gentle breeze, offering shade from the relentless sun. The date palm was the king of the oasis, a true miracle tree. It provided not just sweet, energy-rich fruit, but also wood for building, fibers for ropes and baskets, and leaves for roofing. Beneath the palms, in their protective shade, other crops could be grown: barley, wheat, vegetables, and fruits that would otherwise stand no chance against the desert climate. The oasis was a complete, self-sustaining ecosystem, a testament to human ingenuity working in harmony with nature. But this green paradise didn't just appear by magic. It was the result of constant, back-breaking work and an incredibly sophisticated understanding of hydrology. Every single drop of water was sacred. The lifeblood of the oasis wasn't just the spring or well at its center, but the complex network of channels and systems designed to distribute that precious resource. Listen closely, and you can almost hear the sounds of the ancient oasis. The rhythmic creak of a water wheel, *SQIA*, often turned by a patient donkey or camel, lifting water from a deep well, day in and day out. You can hear the gentle gurgle of water flowing through meticulously maintained irrigation channels, called *Kanats* or *Phalai* in different regions. These were marvels of engineering, often stretching for miles. These underground tunnels tapped into subterranean water sources and brought them to the surface, minimizing evaporation along the way. Building and maintaining these systems required immense communal effort, a shared understanding that everyone's survival depended on the system working flawlessly. A blockage in a channel wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a potential catastrophe for the entire community. This deep respect for water was woven into the very fabric of society. Rules for water allocation were strict and complex, often based on land ownership, family lineage, or time-based shares. Disputes were serious, but cooperation was the norm. Children learned from a young age the importance of conservation. They understood that wasting water was not just a mistake. It was a threat to their family, their neighbors, their entire way of life. Indigenous techniques for water harvesting were passed down through generations. People built small dams to capture flash floodwaters, created terraced gardens to prevent runoff, and used large clay jars to store water, keeping it cool and clean. It was a masterclass in sustainability, born from absolute necessity. Given its critical importance, it's no surprise that control over water was a major source of power and conflict. When the Roman Empire expanded its reach into North Africa and the Middle East, they weren't just conquering land. They were conquering water. Oases became key strategic assets. They were garrisoned with soldiers, fortified, and integrated into the vast logistical network of the empire. For Rome, controlling an oasis meant controlling the trade routes that passed through it, like the lucrative incense and spice trades. It meant being able to sustain legions in otherwise inhospitable territory. The Romans, being brilliant engineers themselves, often improved upon existing water systems, building aqueducts and reservoirs, further solidifying their grip on the region. However, this imposition of imperial power often led to tension with the local desert tribes. For groups like the Berbers or Bedouins, the oases were ancestral lands, integral to their nomadic way of life. They moved with their herds between seasonal pastures and these vital watering holes. Roman control was a direct challenge to their freedom and survival. This created a dynamic and often volatile frontier. There were periods of cooperation where tribes traded with Roman garrisons, serving as guides or mercenaries. But there were also frequent raids and rebellions, as tribes fought to reclaim control of their ancestral water sources. Water became the focal point of a long-running struggle between the settled empire and the nomadic peoples of the sand. A single well could become a flashpoint, a symbol of resistance, or a monument to imperial might. The desert wasn't empty. It was a contested landscape where the struggle for water shaped alliances, fueled conflicts, and determined the fate of empires and entire cultures. So the next time you see a picture of a desert oasis, look beyond its simple beauty. See it as a monument to human resilience. Hear the echoes of the water wheels, the whispers of the farmers in the date groves, and the strategic calculations of generals and tribal leaders. It's a powerful reminder that in the most extreme places on earth, life finds a way, not just through strength, but through wisdom, community, and a profound respect for the precious, life-giving power of water. It's a story of survival, of grit, and of incredible ingenuity. This wasn't your typical farm-to-table lifestyle. This was a daily battle against the sun, the sand, and the scarcity of water. For both the Roman veterans granted land for their service and the indigenous tribes who had called this place home for generations, agriculture was an art form born of necessity. Life here demanded a completely different mindset. You couldn't just scatter seeds and hope for rain. Every single drop of water was precious, every patch of fertile soil a treasure. This challenging environment forced an incredible degree of adaptation, pushing these frontier communities to develop some of the most innovative farming practices of the ancient world. They weren't just surviving. They were thriving in a landscape most would consider impossible to tame. Today, we're going to uncover the secrets of these desert farmers, exploring how they managed to cultivate life at the very edge of civilization. Let's start with the Romans. Picture a veteran legionary, a man who has spent 20 years marching, fighting, and building forts across the empire. As a reward for his service, he's given a plot of land. But it's not the green, rolling hills he might have dreamed of. It's a patch of arid ground, baked by the sun. What does he do? He doesn't give up. He brings Roman engineering genius with him. The Romans were masters of water management, and they applied this knowledge with stunning effectiveness, even in the most remote outposts. They built intricate irrigation systems. We're talking about a network of canals, aqueducts, and cisterns designed to capture every possible source of water. They would channel seasonal runoff from the distant hills, capture precious rainwater during the infrequent storms, and even tap into underground aquifers. These weren't just simple ditches. They were carefully engineered systems that distributed water precisely where it was needed, minimizing evaporation and waste. This allowed them to grow crops that you would never expect to see in a desert. Vineyards producing grapes for wine and sprawling olive groves yielding oil, two absolute staples of the Roman diet. Imagine the sight, rows of green vines and silvery olive leaves shimmering against a backdrop of ochre sand and rock. It must have looked like a miracle, a testament to Roman determination. They also practiced terracing on hillsides. By building stone walls to create flat, stepped fields, they could prevent soil erosion from the rare but intense downpours and create more surface area for cultivation. This technique, learned and perfected in other mountainous parts of the empire, was perfectly adapted to the rugged terrain of the frontier. It was a fusion of large-scale engineering and careful, plot-by-plot land management. But the Romans weren't the only ones here. The indigenous tribes of the region had been farming these lands for centuries before the legions arrived. They possessed a deep, ancestral knowledge of the desert's rhythms. Their approach was less about large-scale engineering and more about a finely tuned harmony with the natural environment. They were masters of what we might today call tri-farming and pastoralism. Their survival depended on an intimate understanding of the local microclimates, the soil types, and the seasonal patterns. Livestock was central to their way of life. They herded sheep and goats, animals perfectly suited to arid conditions. But they didn't just let them wander aimlessly. They practiced a form of transhumance, a seasonal migration of herds between different grazing areas. In the winter, when scant rains might bring a fleeting blush of green to the lowlands, they would graze their animals there. As the summer heat intensified and dried up the low-lying pastures, they would move their herds to higher elevations or into wadis, dry riverbeds, where pockets of moisture and vegetation might persist. This constant movement prevented overgrazing and allowed the fragile pasturelands to recover. It was a sustainable system that respected the land's limits. For crops, they chose hardy, drought-resistant varieties of barley and wheat. They would plant them in depressions or at the base of slopes to take advantage of runoff, a practice known as floodwater farming. They knew exactly when and where to plant to maximize their chances of a successful harvest, relying on a calendar written not in stone, but in the stars and the subtle signs of the changing seasons. Their wisdom was passed down through generations, a living library of survival techniques. What's fascinating is what happened when these two cultures met. It wasn't always a story of conflict. It was often one of exchange and adaptation. The Romans brought their engineering and organizational skills, while the local tribes offered their deep, localized knowledge of the land. Over time, we see a blending of techniques. Perhaps a Roman veteran learned from his local neighbor about the best time to move his goats to a higher pasture, or a local farmer adopted the Roman practice of building small stone cisterns to supplement his water supply for a small garden. This fusion created a unique and resilient agricultural system. Daily life was shaped by this constant need for resourcefulness. A farmer's day would begin before dawn to take advantage of the cooler morning hours. Every tool, whether a Roman iron plow or a locally crafted digging stick, was maintained with care. Nothing was wasted. Olive pits might be used for fuel. Animal manure was a vital fertilizer, and even the tough desert grasses were woven into baskets and mats. This was a world where ingenuity was the most valuable commodity. This deep connection to the land fostered a profound respect for its fragility. These weren't commercial farmers looking to maximize profit. They were families looking to feed themselves and their community. They understood that if they pushed the land too hard, it would push back. This fostered a sense of stewardship, an understanding that their long-term survival depended on maintaining a delicate balance. It was a lesson in sustainability learned the hard way, through generations of trial and error at the edge of the world. Looking at the archaeological remains of these frontier farms, the faint outlines of irrigation channels, the stone foundations of a farmhouse, the remnants of an ancient wine press, we get a powerful sense of this forgotten history. It is a story that reminds us that human resilience and creativity can blossom in the most unlikely of places. It challenges our perception of the Roman Empire as a purely urban or military force, and reveals a quieter, more domestic story of people working the land, building lives, and creating a unique culture on the frontier. What we've discovered is a world far richer, more dynamic, and more human than the traditional narratives of emperors and armies often allow. When we think of ancient history, our minds often conjure images of grand capitals, the gleaming marble of Rome, the majestic palaces of Chinon, the bustling ports of Alexandria. We see history as a story of centers, of power radiating outwards. The edges, the frontiers, are often depicted as desolate, dangerous, and empty mere lines on a map separating us from them. But as we've seen, these lines were never just lines. They were living, breathing spaces, teeming with a diversity of people whose stories are as crucial to our understanding of the past as any emperor's decree. Let's cast our minds back to where our journey began, along the misty, windswept hills of northern Britain. At Hadrian's Wall, we walked in the footsteps of Roman legionaries, men from across the empire, Gauls, Syrians, Spaniards posted thousands of miles from their homes. We imagined their daily routines, the monotonous hours of sentry duty punctuated by the chilling northern rain, the camaraderie forged in the barracks over a game of dice, the letters written home filled with longing and news of a strange green land. But the story of Hadrian's Wall wasn't just about the soldiers. We also met the local Celtic tribes, the Brigantes, whose lives were irrevocably altered by this colossal stone barrier slicing through their ancestral lands. We saw how they navigated a new reality, sometimes resisting, sometimes trading, sometimes integrating. We explored the *VICI*, the civilian settlements that sprouted like mushrooms in the shadow of the forts, where merchants, artisans, innkeepers, and families created a unique hybrid culture. Here, Latin mixed with Brythonic, Roman gods stood alongside local deities, and the rigid lines of empire began to blur in the messy, vibrant reality of daily life. The frontier was not an endpoint. It was a meeting point, a place of constant negotiation. From the damp chill of Britain, we journeyed south to the searing, sun-scorched sands of the Sahara, the southern frontier of the Roman Empire. Here, the challenge wasn't a wall of stone, but an ocean of sand. The border was fluid, defined by scattered oases, fortified trade posts, and the nomadic rhythms of the Garamantes and other desert peoples. We saw how Rome projected its power not through an unbroken line of defense, but through a network of strategic control, protecting the vital caravan routes that brought gold, ivory, and exotic animals to the heart of the empire. Life here was a testament to human resilience. We marveled at the Roman engineers who built incredible irrigation systems, the *Foggara's*, to make the desert bloom. And we gained a profound respect for the desert nomads, the true masters of this environment. They were not simply barbarians to be subdued. They were resourceful traders, skilled guides, and fierce warriors who held the keys to the Sahara. The relationship was one of mutual dependence, a delicate dance of conflict and cooperation. The Romans needed their expertise to cross the sands, and the nomads profited from the trade the empire brought. This frontier teaches us that power is not always about domination. Sometimes it's about adaptation and finding common ground in the most extreme of environments. Our travels then took us to the great rivers of Europe, the Rhine and the Danube, which for centuries formed the pulsating northern border of the Roman world. Unlike the static line of a wall, this was a dynamic, ever-shifting frontier. The rivers were both barriers and highways, simultaneously separating and connecting the Roman provinces from what they called *Germania Libera, *Free Germania, We stood on the reconstructed ramparts of forts, like Vindobona, now modern Vienna, and imagined the constant traffic on the water, Roman patrol boats, barges laden with supplies, and the canoes of Germanic traders slipping across the current. We explored the complex societies on the other side of the river. Far from being a uniform mass of savage tribes, the Germanic peoples were a mosaic of different cultures, alliances, and political structures. We learned about their interactions with Rome, which ranged from violent raids and devastating wars to peaceful trade and diplomatic exchange. We saw Germanic warriors serving as auxiliaries in the Roman army, defending the very border they once threatened. We saw Roman luxury goods, fine pottery, glassware, wine making their way deep into Germanic territory, changing tastes and creating new desires. This Riverine frontier was a crucible of change, a place where cultures clashed, blended, and were forever transformed by their proximity to one another. Finally, we journeyed to the Far East, to the most iconic frontier of all, the Great Wall of China. We stood in awe of its sheer scale, a monumental testament to the ambition and anxieties of successive Chinese dynasties. But as we delved deeper, we discovered that the Great Wall was much more than just a wall. It was a complex system of fortresses, signal towers, barracks, and supply lines, a massive infrastructure project that required an immense logistical effort to maintain. We uncovered the lives of the soldiers who garrisoned its towers, enduring bitter winters and the constant threat of raids from the nomadic Xiongnu and later the Mongols. Through ancient letters written on slips of wood, we heard their voices' complaints about meager rations, worries for their families back home, and reports of movements on the vast steppes beyond. And just like on every other frontier, the story was incomplete without understanding the people on the other side. We explored the world of the steppe nomads, whose entire way of life, their horsemanship, their mobile society, their military tactics, was shaped by the vast, open grasslands. For them, the wall was both an obstacle and an opportunity. It was a symbol of the agricultural empire's attempt to contain them, but it was also a focal point for trade, tribute, and conflict. The history of the Great Wall is not just a history of Chinese defense, but a shared history of two profoundly different worlds, the sedentary and the nomadic, locked in a centuries-long relationship of struggle and interdependence along this immense stone dragon. So, as we bring our grand tour to a close, what have we learned? We've learned that the edges of empires were not wastelands, but worlds in themselves. They were places of incredible diversity, where soldiers, settlers, merchants, nomads, farmers, and rebels lived side by side. We've seen that frontiers were zones of immense challenge, pushing human ingenuity and endurance to their absolute limits. But they were also zones of incredible opportunity and creativity. It was here, at the seams of civilization, that new cultures were forged, new economies were born, and new identities took shape. The people of the Borderlands were bilingual, bicultural, and masters of adaptation. They were mediators, translators, and survivors who understood how to navigate between competing powers. Their lives were a constant negotiation between loyalty and self-interest, between tradition and change, between conflict and coexistence. The stories from Hadrian's Wall, the Sahara, the Rhine, and the Great Wall remind us that history is not a neat and tidy affair. It's messy, complicated, and deeply human. The grand narratives of rise and fall, of conquest and glory, often obscure the small, personal histories of the millions who lived through those times. By looking beyond the wall, we have sought to recover some of those stories. We have tried to give voice to the voiceless, and to see the ancient world not just from the perspective of the palace, but from the watchtower and the nomad's tent. The resilience, ingenuity, and complexity of life on these ancient frontiers offer a powerful and timeless lesson. They show us that human connection can flourish even in the most divided of circumstances, and that the human, Spirit has an astonishing capacity to adapt, to endure, and to create meaning at the very edge of the known world. Thank you so much for joining us on this unforgettable exploration. It has been a privilege to share this journey with you. If the stories of the people who lived on the edge have captured your imagination as much as they have ours, please consider liking this video and sharing it with fellow history lovers. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next deep dive into the fascinating chapters of our shared past. Until next time, stay curious.